Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
Nukes are a wicked problem. They are unimaginably powerful weapons that exist in a diverse and political and flawed world. Stories of nuclear weapons are stories of how states see themselves and see each other, how they interact with each other and with their own publics. The stories of the military-industrial complex and the way that publics view nuclear weapons and how they're affected by them.
9 countries possess nuclear weapons today. Over the season, we've had leading experts guide us through the core issues of each arsenal and probe the plausibility of arms control for each of them. To wrap up the series, I invited an exceptionally knowledgeable colleague to select some of her favorite moments of these episodes and offer her reactions and reflections in response to what our guests have shared with us.
My name is Zuzanna Gwadera. I'm a research analyst and program administrator here at the IISS in London, and I work as part of the Missile Dialogue Initiative. This is a project that we have been implementing with the support of the German Federal Foreign Office since 2019. The project aims to provide in-depth research and promote international dialogue on all sorts of issues related to missile technology, its associated security dynamics, as well as arms control and export control.
Zuzanna's first selected quote is from Manpreet Sethi.
During the Cold War, you had a clear distinction between conventional and nuclear delivery systems, capabilities, all of that. But in today's time, there are cross-domain linkages between highly accurate conventional capabilities being able to hit at nuclear sites. You've got hypersonic missiles, cyber disruption to nuclear command and control, the possibility of space being disrupted and implicating on nuclear deterrence. All of this has added several layers of complexity to arms control.
About half a century ago, missiles were very closely linked to the delivery of weapons of mass destruction. If you detected a missile program in a country, you would probably worry about a nuclear weapons program that could be hiding somewhere in there as well. That's what underpinned some of the early efforts towards slowing down the proliferation of missiles. That was done mainly through the 1987 Missile Technology Control Regime, or the MTCR. And the MTCR set out certain criteria for what a missile or a UAV of concern is, which at the time was a system that was capable of delivering a payload of at least 500 kilograms to a range of at least 300 kilometers. But today, there are many missiles that far exceed these criteria, but they're not designed to carry nuclear weapons. And in fact, more and more countries have been acquiring increasingly capable missiles, as they felt that they needed them to establish or to maintain deterrence against their adversaries, including those that have nuclear weapons. South Korea is an especially interesting example, as they have been pursuing a conventional counterforce strategy against North Korea. Conventional counterforce being the targeting of nuclear arsenals with conventional weapons. South Korea plans to enact what they call a kill chain, which is the idea that they would preemptively target North Korean nuclear and missile sites before weapons could be launched. To that end, they recently unveiled the Hyunmoo-5, which is a ballistic missile that has a massive warhead. It's about 8 tons total, which is, for the record, very large. Any crises on the Korean Peninsula or any other crises with a nuclear dimension could play out much faster and be much more dangerous than ever before. And that's before we even add to the mix any complications from cyber warfare that Dr. Sethi mentions. Lines are getting blurred, and that's not just between different weapon systems, but also between domains. And it is more important than ever to modernize and to negotiate new measures to try and mitigate at least some of the resulting risk.
The second quote comes from Amy Wolf.
During the first Reagan administration, the United States was building up its forces, the Soviet Union was building up their forces, and we did not get a treaty limiting or reducing nuclear weapons. But in the late 1980s, we started to get several of them. And when you ask people what changed, the first thing that comes to mind is Mikhail Gorbachev came in and was president of the Soviet Union, and he wanted to reform the Soviet economy. But Ronald Reagan was in his second term, and he wanted to build a legacy on nuclear disarmament and nuclear arms control. The two of them together improved the US-Russian, US-Soviet relationship. As a result of that, the requirements for the numbers of nuclear weapons began to decline.
Amy is getting at the importance of leaders' personalities in shaping nuclear policy and arms control policies as well. This is a subject that is relatively understudied for pretty good reason. There's no easy way to measure this. But it is not impossible that personal convictions of leaders matter a lot in what a country does with its nukes and its arms control policies. And whether this is for reasons of personal philosophy, ethics, or whether it's simply for making sure that one has a great legacy, it cannot be discounted in looking at the history of nuclear weapons and arms control. Reagan is a very interesting case study here. When he first came into the office, he was quite a bit of a critic of arms control. He also advanced US nuclear modernization. And this is a bit of a simplistic recounting of the history, but the 1980s were quite scary. They are full of nuclear crises. For example, the Able Archer exercise in 1983, which was a case of a misinterpreted US nuclear military exercise. And that must have impacted Reagan quite a lot. But another thing that impacted Reagan was a film. The film is titled The Day After. It depicts the devastating impact of a Soviet nuclear attack on a city in Kansas. And when Reagan first watched that film, he later recounted in his autobiography about how the film left him very depressed and it had really changed his perception of nuclear weapons and their effects. It's interesting how the role and the picture of nuclear weapons has changed in pop culture. It was definitely much more present at the outset of the first nuclear age. It was quite present throughout the 80s with films like The Day After, but also Threads, for example, in the UK. And I think it corresponded with quite a lot of nuclear anxiety. People were really feeling the possibility of a nuclear war being very present. And that was reflected in the activism, but also in pop culture. Ever since the end of the Cold War, that role and the presence of nuclear weapons in film, games, and music has declined or changed a little bit. Instead of films about nuclear weapons, they were often something of a plot device, no pun intended. You would see nuclear weapons in background of films. That is slowly changing. We're getting back there in terms of nuclear anxiety, and the pop culture follows, right? We all remember Barbieheimer, The Beautiful Summer of 2023. It's a Christopher Nolan's film where scientists have to wrestle with how large, literally and figuratively, a nuclear weapon is. And now there is a potential adaptation of a book by Annie Jacobsen called The Nuclear War that Denis Villeneuve seems to be working on. So we're having very big names making films about nuclear weapons, about nuclear war. Donald Trump, the current US president, seems to think about nuclear weapons quite a lot. There was a interview in the 1990s with him where he effectively said that he would like to be in charge of US Russia arms control. He has alluded several times more recently that nuclear weapons are expensive, they don't really make sense. But then in the same breath, in 2017, he was threatening fire and fury on North Korea. So there seems to be a lot going on, and I'm not entirely sure how to read Donald Trump and his nuclear philosophy, but I think a lot of it will translate eventually onto his arms control and any potential modernization and build-up choices over the course of his administration.
Rabia Akhtar has the next quote.
India and Pakistan, over a period of decades, have negotiated a set of confidence building measures and have demonstrated that even limited engagement is possible in the absence of formal arms control agreements. The 1988 Agreement on Non-Attack on Nuclear Facilities requires both sides to exchange lists and coordinates of nuclear installations annually. It was signed in 1988, ratified in 1991, and without fail, despite every crisis that both countries have gone through, Even under nuclear umbrella, the lists continue to be exchanged on 1st of January.
The non-attack agreement between India and Pakistan is a really good example of a very common sense risk reduction measure that has solidified into something very enduring despite a challenging political environment. The agreement was born out of shared risk perception. In 1981, both India and Pakistan observed and learned from Israel's attack on Iraqi nuclear facilities in Iraq, which made them worried about the vulnerability of their own nuclear sites and the potential catastrophic consequences of any military strikes on them on their civilian populations. And the non-attack agreement has since withstood political turmoil and the deterioration of the relationship. I think one could argue created a lasting norm against attacks on nuclear facilities. And two things come to mind here. One, that the non-attack agreement is a good example, though it's also true of most of arms control history, of how competitors or even adversaries can cooperate if they have a shared interest or shared risk perception. At the moment, progress in nuclear risk reduction has stalled, and I think it's especially important to work, whether in Track 2 or Track 1.5 settings, to identify these kernels of shared interest to build on. They don't have to be comprehensive and monumental agreements, but rather just small things to get the conversation going. And the other thing is that the non-attack agreement has relevance to what we've seen happen in Ukraine, namely Russia's attacks and occupation of Ukraine's nuclear power plants, which has in turn sparked fears about the safety of these sites and the possibility of a radioactive release. Now, attacks on nuclear facilities are addressed in international law, including in amendment protocols to the Geneva Conventions, though Russia withdrew from one of them. But on the whole, questions arise of whether that is enough, and if not, what is necessary to strengthen the norm against attacks on nuclear facilities, and whether bilateral or minilateral agreements could play a bigger role.
Here's a quote from Ankit Panda that caught Zuzanna's ear in our episode on North Korea.
When we talk about arms control and the Korean Peninsula, there's a fundamental question, which is North Korea a non-proliferation problem, or is it a deterrence problem? A deterrence problem being one that can be addressed with arms control.
North Korea is, for all intents and purposes, a nuclear armed state. It has conducted 6 explosive nuclear tests. It has flight tested several different ICBMs. It has recently updated its nuclear weapons policy to include a secondary role for the nuclear weapons, which is to repel a South Korean and US invasion. North Korea has been able to grow and diversify its nuclear and missile arsenals despite sanctions. We've recently seen it unveil some 250 transporter erector launches for short-range ballistic missiles, for which they appear to be working on miniaturizing nuclear warheads to use as tactical weapons. And it has all recently become easier for them as they gained stronger support from Russia, who recently vetoed the United Nations panel of experts on North Korea, which was previously tasked with monitoring UN sanctions on the country. Critics of the idea of recognizing North Korea as a nuclear power would say that it hands Kim Jong-un a win, and that it would send the wrong signals to any potential proliferators out there. Of most concern, I think, is South Korea, where the sentiment towards a domestic nuclear weapons program has only grown in the past few years, which the Biden administration tried to quell with increased engagement and reassurance on extended nuclear deterrence. But also Iran, which is on the precipice of acquiring a nuclear weapon, and who might feel emboldened by such a North Korea success story. But on the other hand, as Ankit notes, a recognition would take us out of the present limbo and potentially allow to move forward on de-escalating the situation on the Korean Peninsula with some form of risk reduction and confidence building. The question is, of course, how much North Korea would want to engage on this. Laying off the denuclearization pressure won't exactly heal all wounds between the DPRK and the US and South Korea. And the North Korean arsenal is still tiny in comparison to what the US has. But perhaps some modest risk reduction could be achieved, which could help pave the way towards normalization of relations.
Levi Horowitz shares his view on whether the role of French nuclear forces could be expanded.
Some people argue that this is possible for France to replace the United States, but the majority argue that given current constraints, be them in relation to France's arsenal, but also in relation to France's relations to its neighbors. Many things would need to happen for France to be able to take on that role. Those changes are expensive, both from a financial perspective and, more important, from a political, from a strategic perspective. And for those to happen, we would need to have a political imperative.
I can't emphasize enough just the scale of the change necessary for France to replace the US. And I mean replace, as in extend credible nuclear deterrence over European NATO allies for a very long time. But let's quickly recall why we're talking about this in the first place. The Trump administration's attempt to secure a ceasefire deal in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's seen it rewrite history and pause military and intelligence assistance to Ukraine. That, combined with the administration's wider public questioning of continued US commitment to European security, that has made Europeans nervous. And they are questioning whether the US would come to their defense in a conventional war, not to mention use nuclear weapons for them. And so the debate about possible alternatives to the current arrangement is back on, and this time on the highest levels of government. France is, of course, a much different nuclear power to the US. It has a much smaller arsenal and it doesn't have a nuclear triad, it only has sea and air legs. I don't want to get too deep into matters of force size and structure, how they would need to be changed, or we'd be here all day. But I want to emphasize something that I've not seen talked about as much, which is that nuclear deterrence is not just the weapons themselves. It's not how many of them and their location. That's important, but it's not the whole story. And the overall quality of the relationship between the providers and the recipients of extended deterrence really matters. See, for example, US nuclear weapons do remain in Europe. There is no talk, at least publicly, from what I know, about removing them. And yet, a lot of damage has been done to the credibility of the US extended deterrence as the broader relationship between the US and its allies is tested. Convincing your adversaries and reassuring your allies that you would do the unthinkable is really hard. France's nuclear doctrine is tied to what they term vital interest, which Macron said in 2020 has a European dimension, but that currently feels very loose. And I would argue that for France to take over the task of extended nuclear deterrence from the US would require a tightening of the relationship between France and its allies well beyond what it currently is. And in a Europe which, very much includes France at the moment, where populism runs rampant, anti-European integration sentiments are very much on the rise, and elections are often hard fought and very close. Such tightening doesn't feel particularly feasible right now, especially if you want it to be enduring.
Jingdong Yuan shared his perspective on China's views on arms control.
China's ways of arms control is closely linked to the larger political question. Because for China, there's no way you can have a very meticulously developed all these CBMs or arms control, force structure deployment, all of that, where you can continue to engage in a political kind of competition and very deteriorated political relationship. China would like to start at the political level. How do we interact so we don't infringe on each other's core interests? You can't have just one-dimensional arms control without dealing with all the other variables.
China held working level nuclear arms control talks with the US in November 2023. And that was a welcome start after years of no bilateral engagement on the issue. But they suspended the talks later in July 2024, and they cited the US continued sales of weapons to Taiwan. And this follows a familiar pattern, like when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022, to which China responded with large-scale military exercises around Taiwan. They also cut some of the military-to-military communication channels, which were meant to build confidence and reduce the risk of conflict. Some of these were, I think, restored later. China tying arms control to the wider relationship with the US also mirrors Russia's approach. Russia has suspended New START and has thus far refused to engage, while the US provides support to Ukraine. But China has to navigate the tension between using arms control as a bargaining chip for the wider political objectives and the genuine need for some sort of risk reduction engagement with the US. And that will only grow as the Chinese arsenal grows. China does recognize the value of arms control and risk reduction as a whole. China has a track record of participating in multilateral non-proliferation and arms control initiatives. But also, for example, it has a pre-launch notification agreement with Russia, where the two have to notify each other in advance about launches of any ballistic missiles with a range of over 2,000 kilometers that they launch towards each other. China doesn't have such an agreement with the US, but when it tested an ICBM over the Pacific Ocean in September 2024, China did notify the US, as well as several other countries. And the US later notified China of their own ICBM test launch as a goodwill gesture. Well, as more US missiles are potentially introduced into the Indo-Pacific and as tensions grow on the Korean Peninsula, I think that China might find itself more concerned about things like a misinterpretation of a test launch, which is something that a pre-launch notification agreement would drastically reduce the risk of.
Lydia Mux tackled the obstacles to progress on U.S.-Russian arms control.
There are mainly two challenges for the future of arms control. The first one is the political will. There is no political will in Moscow right now to engage in talks, and with the Trump administration, it is also very difficult to predict whether arms control could be possible. There's also a second challenge, the deep disagreements on what a future treaty should actually include.
The New START will expire in February 2026. That doesn't leave plenty of time for negotiations of a follow-on agreement, which, especially considering some of the possible obstacles in what it could include, could take quite a bit of time. And so what are the other options should a formal treaty not materialize before February 2026? One would be for both the US and Russia to pledge, either together in a joint statement or unilaterally, that they will maintain their forces at New START level. This could include carrying over some of the measures within the New START, such as exchanging some of the basic data on the numbers and the locations of their deployed systems. There is a little bit of precedent to this. In 1981, the US and the Soviet Union did agree to informally abide by the SALT II treaty, even though this wasn't ratified by the US. However, as Lydia says, there are quite a few political constraints on both sides. Russia has obviously outlined theirs. They purportedly were some of the same reasons why Russia eventually decided to invade Ukraine. On the US side, of course, with a Republican administration now in charge, there could be a bit more opposition to arms control as a whole. But also there's obviously a question of whether the US will want to build additional weapons to constrain China. However, even if the US and Russia were to decide on some sort of informal continuation of New START limitations, informal verification, national technical means, only will take you so far for so long if you cannot do technical inspections on site. National technical means is effectively all the unilateral capabilities that countries have to monitor and gather data about the other strategic arsenals. So this could be things like satellite imagery or good old spying. With time, the confidence that each country has in the other's adherence to treaty limits will probably erode. And that is especially if the relationship worsens. It will depend a lot on what happens in Ukraine. And why a lot of the time we talk about moving to a bit more informal and flexible arms control. At strategic level, a verification mechanism, there's nothing like it. And so absent that, the US and Russia could eventually slide into a bit of an arms race, inadvertently or not.
The next election is from Sebastian Brixey Williams.
There are several other countries that have nuclear weapons, whether they're recognized under the NPT or not. So what do? Do you start to bring them in as well? If you wanted to bring the UK and France into this, why not, say, India and Pakistan, which have comparable numbers of weapons as well? And so you get into the kind of conversations about what's sometimes called the strategic chain, where you have Pakistan deterring India, India's deterring China, China's deterring Russia and the US, and maybe NATO as a whole, and the US is deterring China and Russia. Everything is connected, and we have to think in systems ways about these issues.
Here, what Seb is explaining is the difficulty of trying to bring the UK and France into arms control talks with the US and Russia, which is something that Russia previously stated that they wanted. But he is also highlighting a broader characteristic of nuclear weapons issues. It's all very complex and multifactorial. Nukes are a wicked problem. They are unimaginably powerful weapons that exist in a diverse and political and flawed world. Stories of nuclear weapons are stories of how states see themselves and see each other, how they interact with each other and with their own publics. The stories of the military-industrial complex and the way that publics view nuclear weapons and how they're affected by them. They're stories of human errors and technologies and sometimes even of religion. Like, for example, there is a deep and really interesting relationship between Russia's Orthodox Church and the country's nuclear weapons complex. So, some people who think about nuclear policy and disarmament choose to take a systems approach that Seb mentions, which is effectively they try to take a step back and see nuclear weapons as a system, and to map out the different actors involved and the relationships between them, to try and better understand what influences decision-making and how change can be enacted.
Our ninth and final quote is from Or Rabinovitz.
The problem is that you can bomb a nuclear facility, but you cannot bomb nuclear knowledge. The Iranians already know how to set advanced nuclear centrifuges and how to produce highly enriched uranium. That's not going anywhere.
This quote refers to the counter-proliferation strikes against Iran, but Dr. Rabinovitz is also getting at something wider, namely the challenges associated with nuclear disarmament. So say we arrive at a global zero. Nuclear weapons no longer exist in any meaningful form that would allow them to be used. But they existed once. The technology cannot be uninvented, and it lives on in books and in documents, and I think most importantly, in a few generations of scientists and engineers. A disarmed world is also unlikely to be a world in which nuclear energy doesn't exist. So at least some enrichment facilities will probably remain. And then the other thing is that nuclear weapons, like any other weapons for that matter, are, in my opinion, not the root cause of conflict. So war as an idea is highly unlikely to die with nukes. This means that there is a non-zero possibility that a state or multiple states, faced with a threat to their security, may decide to rearm, potentially causing others to do so as well. And any such rapid rearmament would be very destabilizing and highly dangerous. So, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty sets out the 3 principles of disarmament. It needs to be transparent, it needs to be verifiable, and indeed, it needs to be irreversible. And those in the disarmament and arms control communities have been thinking about what irreversibility really means in a world that cannot uninvent nukes. Some have proposed to not think about irreversibility as in binary terms, but instead to think about it as a spectrum, with the task being to try and get as close as possible to irreversibility and make any rearmament effort as detectable and time-consuming and difficult and ultimately as unattractive as possible. There are different aspects of irreversibility: technical, political, legal, military, social, different sets of measures as well that could be implemented in each of these domains. For example, past cases of countries dismantling their nuclear weapons programs, like Kazakhstan or South Africa, as well as the entirety of the current non-proliferation architecture, can teach us a lot about what would be necessary for a comprehensive future disarmament verification mechanism. But also, some practitioners argue that in addition to any such mechanism or set of mechanisms, something larger is needed, a paradigm shift, if you will, about the role and the value of nuclear weapons as a security tool, and a shift towards enduring stigmatization of them as an enormous moral mistake of the past. The world is nowhere near disarmed, of course, and not much progress has been done recently towards it. But the conceptual work on irreversibility is really interesting, and it is done in preparation, should the moment eventually arrive.
Thank you for listening, and to our guest and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.